finishing up today with Andrew Jackson and white men's democracy, for perfect term for the age. And Andrew Jackson, of course, is the great symbol and the great spokesman for democracy. Any man can be president. Look at me, I'm president. He is also, interestingly enough, a great hero of Donald Trump. In fact, when Donald Trump moved into the Oval Office, I forget who was on the wall at the time, probably George Washington. He took down George Washington and put a portrait of Andrew Jackson up. So the question would be, what does Donald Trump see that's so interesting in Andrew Jackson? Several things. The other question I had was, should he be on Mount Rushmore? He was considered and negated to be put on Mount Rushmore, and there's good reasons for that. So we saw he is a Scot from Scottish background, grew up on the frontier, orphaned, penniless at an early age, clawed his way up on a rough and tumble frontier. This is a very violent place. People are biting each other's ears off. They are gouging out each other's eyes. They are fighting in the streets. This is the frontier. He succeeded through his own efforts, basically, with not much help from anybody, a lot of personal tragedies along the way, loses his wife, loses pretty much everybody around him at one point or another, but perseveres. He is old hickory. He is tough as hickory. He also said, very famous quote from him, which I really like, "I was born for a storm and a calm does not suit me." This is a guy who you imagine, if it's calm, he's going to create a storm. This is his favored atmosphere. Another reason Trump kind of likes him, I think. Very charismatic, very forceful personality. Like George Washington, he sees himself as a father of his country. And like George Washington, he had no kids of his own. So he sees the public as his family in a way. Very loyal to his friends, inspired intense loyalty, again, like George Washington. Very quick in thought, very quick in action, and usually right. A very good judge of character. He could size up a situation and jump in without any hesitation. Absolutely courageous to the point of being foolhardy at one point. When he died, a reporter at the scene on his plantation asked one of his older slaves, "Well, do you think the general's going to go to heaven?" Because he had done some good and bad things in his life. And the slave turned around and told the reporter, "If the general wants to go to heaven, ain't nobody going to stop him." And that was a pretty good evaluation of Andrew Jackson's character. He became a little paranoid in his old age. Again, if you look at that last slide under White Men's Democracy, this is a guy with an iron backbone, but he did become a little paranoid for good reason. He had 2 assassination attempts on his life, both of them during his presidency. The first one in 1833, this is a guy who had mental issues, and it's a case of the spoil system gone bad. He was promised a job and did not get it for whatever reason, and comes up on the White House grounds and assaults Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson's walking with 1 or 2 friends or aides. He physically attacks Jackson, who again looks like that last slide. He is a very old man at this point. The guy draws blood. Andrew Jackson hits him back. Now remember, this is a guy in his 70s who's walking with a cane. And Andrew Jackson picks up the cane and starts beating the guy across the head. His friends jumped in, pulled the guy off. They took him off. He ended up in a mental institution. 2 years later, another certifiably crazy guy comes up again on the White House grounds to Andrew Jackson, someplace in Washington, pulls out a pistol from 10 feet away, points it at Jackson, and fires. The gun misfired. Everybody's standing in shock. Jackson and a couple of his friends are completely surprised by this. The guy pulls out a second pistol, aims it at Jackson's head, pulls the trigger. That one misfired as well. Remember, guns only have 1 shot. Okay? At this point, Jackson's friends jump in, haul the guy off. They took the pistols out to the firing range the next day, tried them both, reloaded them. They fired perfectly. So we have no idea what happened with that. But twice he got away from assassinations. This is a violent age, a violent man. Andrew Jackson dueled constantly. We talked about dueling before. Andrew Jackson had in his life over 100 duels, including a number of them when he was a pretty old guy. His first duel, he fought at the age of 21. His first trial in court, he was the defendant. The prosecutor got the guy convicted. Andrew Jackson's guy lost, and Andrew Jackson, as a result, challenged the prosecutor to a duel. So people in Nashville figured out pretty quickly, you don't want to go into court against Andrew Jackson because if he loses, he's going to challenge you to a duel, which he did a number of times. The most common cause of dueling was, of course, any slur that people made against Rachel, because technically he was a bigamist and she was an adulteress. She was not divorced when they were married. And there's all kinds of little things that appeared in the paper anonymously. One of them read, "Andy, oh Andy, how many men have you hanged in your life?" He was a lawyer. "How many weddings make a wife?" But you never said this to his face because, of course, the instant reaction would be he would challenge you to a duel. He dueled over horse races. He dueled over debts that he had. He dueled basically at the drop of a hat. Over 100 duels, and killed 20 men. We elected a man president who had killed 20 people. But this is the 1830s. One of his most famous duels, it was over a horse race. His horse lost. He challenged the guy who won the race to a duel. They went out 8 paces, which is not very far. The other guy is one of the best shots in Tennessee. Jackson wasn't bad, but this guy was a much better shot. Andrew Jackson let him take the first shot. And Andrew Jackson gets a bullet in the chest. Again, a couple inches away from his heart, would have killed him instantly, but gets it in the chest. He doesn't move, of course, in a duel. Once the other guy has shot, you get your turn. Andrew Jackson takes careful aim, shoots him through the head, and kills him instantly. Then Andrew Jackson falls down, and he says to the doctor, and this is a quote, there were witnesses, "If he had shot me through the brain, sir, I would still have killed him." So Andrew Jackson's a very unusual character. He gets a second bullet in the shoulder when he's 40 years old in a street brawl. You're 40 years old. These are adult men, and they're down in the street punching and kicking each other. They both came up shooting. The other guy got a bullet in the leg. Andrew Jackson got a bullet in the shoulder. So he goes through life with 2 lead bullets in his body. So lead poisoning, we don't know what's going on there. He also had malaria from the Indian campaigns. He also took, and I'm not making this up, a vitamin supplement that was popular at the time that was powdered white lead. So we know what lead does to the human body. So it's amazing that he lived as long as he did. He's an unusual character. Okay, the Jackson presidency. He saw himself as a representative of the common man, standing up for the little guy, and his goal was to use the federal government to equalize wealth, to equalize conditions. He is by nature a local and states' rights guy, a more Republican guy. So again, his goal is shrinking national government. He vetoed internal improvements, unless they were pretty significant, but most of them he refused to fund. He paid off the national debts, and he raised import tariffs to raise the money to pay off the national debts. This leads to the first of his 3 crises in his administration, slides 5 and 6, the 3 main actions of Andrew Jackson's presidency, and the first is probably the most important, nullification. This is in 1832, right after he is reelected, and this is an issue of who has the power in government, which has been an issue in the news with Trump and coronavirus just this last couple of days. Who has the power to open up states after coronavirus, the states or the president? That's to be determined. Nullification was actually a pretty simple issue. The tariff had been raised, and the state of South Carolina, along with other southern states, but South Carolina is the one that challenges it, says we are not going to collect this tariff. South Carolina was particularly hurt. Its economy is completely dependent on export crops, which means that it is importing everything else that it uses. So they were paying a good amount of money in tariffs. This is not a small tariff. It was like 25%, first of all, so it's significant. They were paying more. So they insist that a state, South Carolina, can nullify, cancel out, reject as unconstitutional a federal law, a tariff, because the state believed that it was unconstitutional. They are arguing on the grounds that when the former colonies joined together to create the United States, that these states kept a lot of their power. This was only a week after the 32 election. South Carolina stopped collecting the tariffs, starts approving and planning for a 25,000-man militia. Okay, Andrew Jackson, what are you going to do about this? Andrew Jackson, who actually believed in states' rights, also believes in the Union, also believed in the cause of America, and he argued that when the states became part of the United States, they gave up the majority of their powers to the United States instead of keeping it. So basically, Jackson is arguing federal law trumps local power, trumps state power. I'm quoting, "The laws of the United States must be executed. Those who told you you could peacefully prevent their execution deceive you. Their object is disunion. Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you ready to incur the penalty for treason?" So Andrew Jackson sees South Carolina as treasonous. He sends negotiators. He doesn't want to push South Carolina to withdraw from the Union because he's worried other states may join it. So he sends some negotiators. He also goes to Congress and gets Congress to pass very quickly the Force Act, or the Force Bill, which allows the president to use military force against civilians in the United States, not against foreigners overseas, but against our own citizens. He also begins calling up 50,000 troops and let South Carolina know that he has the power and he will use it. Again, Andrew Jackson, I will hang the first man I can get my hands on under the first tree I can find. What happens? It's a huge game of chicken. Who's going to back down here? South Carolina backed down. Upshot, the tariff was slowly lowered to a much lower rate, so they stopped complaining about it. Andrew Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun, was from South Carolina. He immediately resigned, became a senator from South Carolina, and becomes the great spokesman for slavery all the way up to the Civil War. And Andrew Jackson says, watch out, the next crisis will be over slavery. And he also said, watch Texas. Watch what's going on in Texas, which will be pretty soon. Okay, so that's nullification. Jackson won that one. The next issue to come up are the Indian removals. This issue, again, is a populist issue. He's standing up for the people, particularly white settlers. And this is a majority rights versus minority rights. We had, as a nation and as states, made all kinds of treaties with Native Americans. As far as I know, in Native American history, there isn't a single treaty that we broke. We had promised the southeastern tribes their land forever in treaty negotiations. The background, of course, is the 5 civilized tribes in the southeast: the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Seminole, and the Chickasaw. Okay, I don't care about the names, not important. The Cherokee are the ones that are important. The largest tribe, these were called the 5 civilized tribes because they had done everything we asked them to do. They had become farmers, they had adopted Christianity, they were literate, they ran their own schools. 8% were prosperous enough to become slave owners. So 8% of the Cherokee actually owned slaves. The Cherokee also had their own printing press and were printing their own books in the Cherokee language. In the War of 1812, these tribes had fought on the American side against the British and actually were paid military pensions in some cases. Okay, so what happens? In that area, of course, when we saw Eli Whitney come out with the cotton gin, this is perfect land for cotton. And settlers begin moving west in the southern states, and they run smack into Cherokee and Creek territory. These are reservations. This was land reserved to them by law. Georgia particularly defied federal authority. The state of Georgia began to survey Creek land, 23 million acres, and other states began to survey Cherokee land. The Cherokee, having college-educated Cherokee as well, took it to court. It was appealed. It goes in front of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says that, and I am quoting, Indian nations are independent political communities. They retain their original natural rights as the undisputed possessors of the soil from time immemorial. Okay? They had the right to this land. The Supreme Court said the settlers could not take Cherokee and Choctaw land. Congress also debated the issue. Congress rejected the Cherokee and Choctaw claims by a very small margin, 102 to 98 in the House and 1 vote in the Senate. So Congress supported the state of Georgia taking the lands. The Supreme Court said this was illegal, this was unconstitutional. Andrew Jackson is president at the time. The removals do not happen under his administration, but he's the guy who made the decision to do it, and Martin Van Buren executed after he left office. Okay? Andrew Jackson's decision was to remove the southeastern tribes, particularly Cherokee and Choctaw. So he ordered the U.S. Army to round up these tribes and move them west. They were moved to the state of Oklahoma, which at the time, west of the Mississippi, was Indian territory. It happened in 1938 under Van Buren. 20,000 were moved 800 miles. Doesn't happen overnight. They start in the fall. They are moving all the way through the winter. And this is called by Native Americans the Trail of Tears. 25% death rate. The old, the young, the sick did not survive. They packed up whatever they could. The Cherokee also brought their slaves, which is an ongoing issue in Oklahoma, and they moved to Oklahoma with whatever they could take with them, with an extremely high death rate. They are moved into an area they do not know among tribes that they are not friendly with. Why? Because settlers wanted the land, particularly for cotton planting. So when it was brought up, should we put Andrew Jackson on Mount Rushmore? This is one of the first things people brought up. What about the Indian removals? This is not a heroic part of American history, and it is unconstitutional. The third issue is the Bank War, which sounds complicated, but it's not. Again, Andrew Jackson sees himself as standing up for the public, for the common man. He said, government must not let the rich and powerful bend it to their selfish purposes. And he saw the bank as the octopus bank, strangling the average American. Little history on the bank. And Alexander Hamilton, you remember, established the first national bank. It had a 20-year charter, 80% funded by private interests, which means 80% of the profit goes to wealthy people. It expired under Madison. Madison rechartered the bank. Its second charter is also coming due. And again, it was 80% private, 20% federal money. Why did we need a bank? Absolute chaos without a national bank. There was no regulation. There was no even printing of a standard American currency before we had the national bank. The national bank required smaller banks to have gold, to hold gold, to bank their paper money if they were publishing paper money. So basically, the National Bank is a regulator of other banks, but the profit went to the wealthy. It comes under recharter. The director of the bank is a perfectly named guy named Biddle. It was called Biddle's Bank. You can't make up these names. And Andrew Jackson decides, I'm going to kill this bank. Why? Nobody likes banks. If you think about banks today, nobody likes banks today either. We have all kinds of problems with banks. At the time, there was no banking insurance. People put their money in the bank, their life savings. The bank went under, or a guy disappeared with the money, and they had no recourse. They had lost everything. There was no regulation on banks and no insurance on your deposits. Andrew Jackson personally had lost money in bank failures several times. So he is very anti-bank. So is the American public. People didn't like banks. They didn't like bankers. Not much has changed. Okay? Biddle thought you have to have a national bank. This is clear to everyone. And I'm quoting, if Andrew Jackson kills the bank, it will kill him. He won't be reelected. His reelection campaign is one single issue, the bank, in 1832. Andrew Jackson, of course, don't mess with this guy. The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. And as Andrew Jackson said, the people, sir, are with me. And he was absolutely right. The people supported him. The whole election is a referendum on the bank. Everybody, all of his advisors, his cabinet said, you have to recharter the bank. But Andrew Jackson said, no, I don't like banks, and the people don't like banks. The upshot, who won that election? Andrew Jackson won overwhelmingly, popular vote in Electoral College. He immediately vetoes what he called the monster bank. And he didn't want to wait. He removed federal deposits from the National Bank. The National Bank, desperate for money, how do you kill something? You took the money out of it. Starts recalling its loans to state banks. The state banks start recalling their loans to smaller banks and towns. The smaller banks go to the public, and start recalling the loans they had made to the average people. So if I went to a bank and I borrowed $200 to buy a team of horses or a plow, the bank now is coming after me and saying, you owe that money, because they're asking us to make our payments to the bigger banks, and to the national bank. So it's kind of a snowball effect. The upshot was, long story short, total economic collapse, the biggest economic crisis in American history before the Great Depression of the 1930s. In 1937, after he left office, the whole economy collapsed. 90% of all manufacturing was closed. 40% of the banks went under, which meant all the people who had money in the banks lost everything. Did Andrew Jackson intend this? Absolutely not. He didn't understand banking. Neither did most people. Don't forget, we had the same thing happen 10 years ago, and we probably will again, because regulating banks is a tricky business. Henry Clay, his political enemy, begins to call President Jackson King Andrew. The government will become an elective monarchy. We're going to elect kings. Andrew Jackson had the power, unintentionally, to shut down the entire economy. This is the other reason he's not on Mount Rushmore and should never have been put on the $20 bill. Of all people, you don't put Andrew Jackson on money. He didn't understand the whole issue and created a huge economic collapse. So, Jacksonian democracy, he is a great figure in American history because he changed the definition of democracy, not to the wealthy, not even to the educated and talented, but to all men, to all adult white males. He is also an incredibly strong president. He uses strong executive powers. He started the two-party system. He really actually believed all men were politically equal in government. He totally believes in the common man, just like Thomas Jefferson did, only Thomas Jefferson said, let's limit power to the educated and the talented. He creates the first really powerful executive, the first really powerful president, which is why Trump has a picture of him in the White House on his wall. He's powerful in domestic affairs. He's powerful in foreign affairs. Example, The 6 previous presidents to Andrew Jackson had vetoed a total of 9 bills that Congress passed. Andrew Jackson vetoed 12 himself. And the struggle in Congress, the struggle in America becomes between Andrew Jackson as president and Congress. Does any of this sound familiar? On the other hand, he also always worked for the people. He did not do it for his own benefit. He does not get wealthy for it. He thought the bank was unconstitutional. So what ties these 3 issues together is in each case, he is working for or standing up for the common man, even though the Indian removals were entirely illegal and the bank crisis created a huge depression. He saw expansion of the country, Indian lands, as good for democracy. This will create more places for small farmers. The same reason Thomas Jefferson did. He also saw it good for Native Americans. If they were left there, what would happen to them? They would probably be slaughtered by the settlers. So by removing them indirectly, he is, according to his own philosophy, helping to save Native Americans by moving them out of harm's way. As he left the White House, one of the last things he said was, "Never once take your eyes off Texas." So that's going to lead into some problems very, very shortly. But we'll be moving on into slavery next time. Stay safe, stay well, enjoy the sun.